Good morning Europe and good afternoon Jakarta. Selamat sore Bapak Ibu semua di Indonesia. Welcome to our webinar on EU forest policy. It is initiated by the Indonesian Embassy in Brussels to have the current development and recent development about the EU policy on the forest. Before we start the event, sharp at 9:30, I would like to give you some basic rules about how this webinar going to take. At first, we are going to have the opening remarks from our ambassador, His Excellency Andre Hadi. And then afterward, we'll continue with the presentation from the AQUIS EU Law and Policy, moderated by Mr. Yewen Hess. And after that, we can enter the session for the question and answer. And for the question and answer, it only be have through the chat room on this Zoom room. So you will not going to have the chance to have the live speaking, but it's only through the chat room. So, and for the question, you should add the hashtag you should end with the hashtag after the question. So I think without further ado, we can start for the webinar with a with the opening remarks from our ambassador.
Terima kasih, Ibu Mary. Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you in Europe, and good afternoon to all of you in Asia. Ibu Ina, my good friend, Ibu Ina Krishnamurti, advisor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs on economic diplomacy. I see also some familiar friend here, Pak Mas Pungki. Selamat pagi. It is an honor for me to be here today at the webinar on EU forest policy, challenges and opportunities for Indonesia. I'm delighted to see there are numerous participants on this webinar. I would like to extend my appreciation to Mr. Jeroen Jensen, Managing Partner, AQUIS EU Law and Policy, in making this webinar possible today. With his vast experience and knowledge on European Union policies, Mr. Jeroen Jensen is our main speaker today. We have also with us Pak Jelman Haas, Secretary General of Belgian Alliance for Sustainable Palm Oil, who will be our moderator. He has been working very closely with my colleagues in the Embassy for Indonesia in promoting Indonesian sustainable palm oil. The main purpose of this webinar is to raise awareness of the relevant stakeholders in Indonesia on the development on the EU forest policy. The policy will create both opportunities and challenges. Bapak, Ibu, ladies and gentlemen, we might recall that Madam Ursula von der Leyen, President of European Commission, introduced the European Green Deal strategy as their new ambition in forming the new European way of life and the lead for climate neutrality. We welcome the European green policy as long as non-discriminatory and should be in accordance with the relevant international laws. Their main target is to have a net zero carbon emission in 2050. In achieving this goal, the European Union will utilize its diplomacy, forest, and trade policies with other partners. This will eventually affect trade relations between Indonesia and the European Union. Indonesia has demonstrated its commitment to combat deforestation and protect biodiversity. In doing so, sustainable forest management has been enforced in our economic activities. Allow me to share with you several measures undertaken by the government of Indonesia, namely National Action Plan for Sustainable Palm Oil, Indonesia Sustainable Palm Oil Certification in its mandatory moratorium of palm oil plantation permit in 2014, and timber legality assurance system. Indonesia is the first and the only country to have its timber certification recognized by the European Union under the framework of Forest Legal Enforcement and Trade Voluntary Partnership Agreement with the European Union. In many occasions, I have asked the European Union commitment to implement Article 13 of FLAG VPA on market incentive. Just to share with you, Indonesia also received 56 million US dollar grant from Norway as the first payment for the success in reducing deforestation and carbon emission under the framework on reducing emission from deforestation and forest degradation cooperation scheme. Ladies and gentlemen, we shall commence our discussion now. Your active participation will be valuable in enriching our discussion today. The floor is yours, Pak Jelman Haas. Terima kasih. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, and good morning and an afternoon to Jakarta from my side as well. As the Ambassador mentioned, under the Green Deal, there are a lot of initiatives taken already in Europe. And today, the webinar explores to raise the awareness of challenges and opportunities, and to explore what it would take to position Indonesia as a frontrunner in this debate. As Mary already mentioned, you can already ask questions via chat. And this as well during the first intervention, the intervention of our speaker, Jeroen Jansen, managing partner and founder of opaque. He has 3 decades of experience in EU law, policy and diplomacy, culminating in a position as Deputy Ambassador at the Dutch Embassy in Beirut, Lebanon. He led the EU regulatory trade and government affairs practice of a leading international law firm in Brussels for 13 years. And today he has explored what is happening in Europe. And Mr. Jeroen Jansen, I'll give the floor to you. Yeah. I see that.
Yeah, it's working, I think.
Okay.
A very good morning. Thank you, Jelman, for the kind introduction. Excellency, Ambassador Andre Hadi, I would also like to extend my warm thanks to you for the introduction and for hosting this very important event. In particular, I think also our thanks to go to Mary Indria Sari and Wahida Maghrabi as part of the core team. Our team has experienced an energized and very insightful preparation. Excellent team spirit, and I'm very impressed with the commercial section overall at the embassy. That is a good prelude for further engagement as we see it moving forward. What I would like to do is to share this presentation with my colleague Laura Zemmler, who will take a deeper dive into the EU forestry policy as it is in process of being developed and agreed. Before doing that, I think it is interesting to set the scene where this EU forestry policy should be situated and how also in the context of the trade review that the trade policy review that the European Union is currently conducting, how this could be an opportunity for Indonesia, both at the national classic diplomatic level, as well as for the industries and companies in Indonesia to have I was temporarily muted. I think that the trade relationship between the European Union and Indonesia is very significant. I will just quote from the statistic that were provided by the European Commission. The bilateral trade in goods between the EU and Indonesia amounted to 23.8 billion euros in 2019, with EU exports worth 9.4 billion and EU imports from Indonesia worth 14.4 billion. So that is a very significant trading relationship. Overall, we will also see in the course of our presentation that there is further room for engagement as well as for benefits for both the European as well as the Indonesian side. It is not a zero-sum game, these new policy and regulations, and Indonesia has proven in the recent past that it can adapt and work collaboratively with European partners to optimize international trade and commerce between Indonesia and the EU. To set the context, perhaps we can go to the first picture slide. Now, I choose this picture also as part of the scene setting because many stakeholders internationally have always viewed the European Union as a closed, opaque mechanism that basically tries to, as it says here in the title, rule the world. And I think today what we will try to achieve with the example of the EU forestry policy is to demonstrate that you as Indonesian stakeholders and third countries more generally, you can be part of the ruling class. Because what is part of our objective is to demystify this image that the European Union is a closed shop and will decide for you as the business community in Indonesia and elsewhere how to conduct their business, which norms and standards should be applied. Our message is at the end of the day, and I will come back to that in the end of the conversation today, is that you can have a significant impact and work collaboratively with the European Union to shape future policy and regulation. The European Union policy making is based on a consultative legislative and policy process, and the institutions, the Commission, the European Council and the Member States, as well as the European Parliament, are generally very open to receive information and data and positions in the form of position papers and other information from third countries and from stakeholders, industry stakeholders in those countries. So there is a fantastic opportunity, I think, to engage and continue to engage. It's a little bit the motto that you have to get a place at the table, and unless you are at the table, you will be on the menu. It's a bit firm, but that is what it amounts to. Now we can move to the next slide, please. Now the context of what we see in this file with regards to EU forestry is not an isolated topic that exists in splendid isolation. It is very well connected to other main policy initiatives, including the Green Deal, but also the European Trade Policy Review. And I would like to spend a few minutes on just outlining what the background of that very significant EU Trade Policy Review is. Why is it happening now? I think that for a long time, there was already a belief that the European trade policy should be reviewed and overhauled and adjusted where possible. However, the COVID epidemic has driven this process forward and accelerated the awareness of the need and the importance to look at trade and trade recovery, economic recovery more generally, as a result of the COVID crisis. The other elements that we have seen is that the international instability with regards to US-led trade wars, or at least the stress that was produced by decisions across the globe, with the US probably taking a very, I would say, a very tough stance also on exports from Europe to the US to look at the trade balance in particular, that was not convenient for the US presidency. We saw that in itself, and with the competition from China in several parts of the world, the disruptions of the supply chain that we have seen with regards to medical equipment. To that point, on the 26th of November, there was a pharmaceutical strategy unveiled that was also based on the experience in the last 6 to 9 months with disruptions in the global supply chain. So all these things together resulted in significant stress on the system. At the same time, there was also, and this is also relevant for the forestry discussion, there's an increasing awareness that sustainable development and combating climate change will be horizontal topics that will be appearing in multiple policy areas, including in forestry. And then the last element that drove this need for a trade policy reform and more, how shall we say, more attentive European engagement is that in the European Union itself, a globalized trade system was perceived by many regions and citizens as not necessarily a big advantage. They were critical. Nationalism and populism contributed to calls for reduction of international trade and supply lines. And that in itself is something that needs to be addressed, because in order to have a proper policy, you need to have the acceptance and embrace of that policy in the European Union. Is there a next slide? So, in summary, the most important objectives of the new EU trade policy will be a swift socio-economic recovery, open strategic autonomy, and a rule-based international trade order. It was already mentioned by the ambassador that the measures that the European Union would, and the policies that they would develop, need to be in conformity with international rules that we have all agreed to, in particular in the WTO context, the reform of which is in itself an important objective of the trade policy review. Open strategic autonomy is actually one of the key elements in this trade policy review. We want, on the one hand, we want to make sure that we continue to be an open trading bloc, but at the same time, and that creates opportunities for existing and new partners, at the same time, we have to recognize that it is, in some cases, unhelpful to be exposed to reliance on others in the global supply chain. And the example I gave already was with regards to medical supplies during the COVID crisis. In terms of pharmaceuticals as well, you see the same challenge. We have an over-reliance on pharma production in China and in India, for example, and that makes the European market and the European care system, healthcare system, extremely vulnerable. So this is one element. The other element is that the European Union considers that the trade agreements that they currently have in place are sometimes not properly implemented. And in order to upgrade the compliance and the implementation of these trading agreements, there has been a new official created, the European Trade Enforcement Officer. The ASEAN countries in Brussels had the benefit of meeting with the Trade Enforcement Officer, and it is clearly an instrument that on the one hand will have stricter implementation of these trade agreements ensured, but on the other hand, it is also let's say the additional value that trading partners, including in Indonesia, can derive from these trading agreements. that will be part of that mix. There is one thing that I wish to say in terms of trade sovereignty and the European Union. Increasingly, we will also see initiatives from the European Union to strengthen the role of the euro in international trade, to be less dependent on the US dollar. And secondly, that we will see more activity from the European partners standing up against extraterritorial jurisdiction established by the United States in the field of international sanctions. This is a sovereignty issue. It is not directly relevant for trade with third countries in other respects, but it is an illustration of the willingness to address self-confidence in the European Union. At the same time, as I mentioned, it is a very open process, policy making in Europe, and also in the field of international trade. There has been a public consultation that has been recently concluded. The results of that public consultation will be made available in the first half of December. And between that and the next stage, where we come back to at a later stage in the presentation, there will be ample opportunity for third countries and industry federations, individual companies, to reach out with their concerns or their objectives to the European institutions and actively combine efforts to bring the point across and properly address interests from Indonesia and its multiple stakeholders. With that scene setting, I would like to invite my colleague Laura Zemler. She is one of our senior policy officers at Acquis to enlighten you about the finer details of the EU forestry policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeroen. Good morning, Your Excellency Ambassador Hadi, team at the Embassy of Indonesia in Brussels, and distinguished guests. I am very pleased to speak to you today along with Jeroen in this webinar about the challenges and opportunities which the EU forest-related policy and the upcoming new EU forest strategy will pose to Indonesian stakeholders. Thank you also very much again, Your Excellency, for the introductory words and the kind invitation today. As Jeroen has mentioned, the EU forest-related policy fits in the broader picture of the EU trade policy review and global developments on trade and the EU's reactions on this. And in the next parts of our presentation, I will guide you through, first of all, the key elements of the existing EU forest strategy. Then we will look at why a new EU forest strategy will be needed and what the process and the content of this are expected to look like. And in points 5 to 7, we will then look at other EU forest-related policies where the discussions are currently ongoing and where significant impact is expected on Indonesian stakeholders and on trade of Indonesian companies with the EU. And in wrapping up, we will then look at the concrete challenges and opportunities that these EU forest-related policies are expected to pose for Indonesia. And then I will hand back to Jeroen again to discuss how concretely interested stakeholders can engage in the EU process. As you can see in this slide here, the EU forest policy is a field that actually overlaps with a number of policy fields. It overlaps with industry policy, plant and health protections, trade, environment, energy, biodiversity, and climate change, of course, as has been mentioned already, forest protection and agriculture. So this is a very broad field. And because of this, it is sometimes difficult for affected stakeholders to be able to monitor all of these developments So in our presentation today, we will in particular look at 3 developments that are of key impact for Indonesian stakeholders. The first one of this is, of course, the EU forest strategy that is currently in place and the changes that will come after. In this context, it's important to bear in mind that forests represent more than 42% of EU land area, and that the EU has really identified forest areas as crucial for protecting its biodiversity, for reducing or for absorbing carbon dioxide, and for regulating the water cycle. So forest protection really is a core field that the EU is prioritizing at the moment. Then also it's important to know that there's no common EU policy for forests or for the forestry sector, but this is actually a field that falls within the competence of the EU member states. Nevertheless, the EU does contribute through its policies and legislation to implementing sustainable forest management throughout the EU, and it also affects the member states' decisions in this field. And because this policy field of forest policy is so fragmented and complex, there has been an EU forest strategy in place since 1998. So if we then come to this slide, the forest strategy currently in place has 2 main objectives. Firstly, sustainable management of EU forests. And secondly, and this is particularly important for Indonesian stakeholders, the promotion of sustainable forest management and the reduction of deforestation globally. Then, of course, we can ask ourselves, so what, if the strategy is already in place, why then do we need a new strategy? There are 3 main reasons for this. Firstly, of course, the global policy environment over the past years, since 2013, that is, has changed quite a bit. And the EU has also adapted its priorities to these changes. So the EU has now committed to new climate, energy, and environment goals. And the forestry sector, of course, will need to contribute to achieving these goals. Then secondly, of course, there's by now the European Green Deal, which is a headline ambition of the EU. And the new 2020 or post-2020 EU forest strategy is one of the actions that is actually planned under this Green Deal, with the ambition to achieve a sustainable or green transition. And then thirdly, third point of why we need a new forest strategy, because of this variety of policy fields of relevance to forest policy, the member states have mandated the Commission to come up with a new forest strategy to be able to have one coherent approach to address all issues at once. This leads us to the post-2020 EU forest strategy, which is currently being worked out. It is expected that the European Commission will publish the communication on this in the first half of 2021. And this will be a non-legislative document. There is currently already a roadmap in place on this new EU forest strategy, and feedback is asked until the 4th of December. So this is a very imminent way to be able to contribute. It's only next week. But it's of course important to note that this is not the only opportunity to engage. Engagement can also take place at a later stage with the Commission directly. But there is currently a roadmap that can be responded to. A public consultation is supposed to be open soon. And also in preparation of this new forest strategy, there have been a number of parliament resolutions where the European Parliament has made key demands for this forest strategy. One of these demands is an enforceable supply chain due diligence mechanism with penalties. So if this would be included, that would be quite impactful on stakeholders. Then the inclusion of trade and sustainable development provisions in FTAs. This, of course, would be relevant in the ongoing negotiations on the FTA with Indonesia. And the European Parliament has demanded to be involved in the implementation of the strategy. This might also further complicate the engagement of Indonesian stakeholders with the Commission. Then beyond this new forest strategy, which we're expecting, there has also been a communication on stepping up EU action to protect and restore the world's forests. This communication provides the framework for the EU's forest-related policies globally. There are key priorities of this. Firstly, there's the reduction of EU consumption footprint and the encouragement of deforestation-free supply chains in the EU. Secondly, partnering up with producer countries to reduce forest pressures, also of key relevance to Indonesian stakeholders. Thirdly, strengthening international cooperation. And there are a few key elements in here. Firstly, that this would also address the sustainability of supply chains in the context of relevant international commodity bodies, coffee, cocoa, timber. Secondly, this would be to promote trade agreements that include provisions on the conservation and sustainable management of forests, and that encourage trade of forest-based products that do not cause deforestation. This could even include incentives in the trade agreement for such products. So that could actually be an interesting angle for Indonesian stakeholders. The fourth priority under this communication is to redirect finance to support more sustainable land use practices. And the fifth point is supporting the availability and quality of information and also supporting research and innovation in this field. So the next action is the planned reinforcement of the implementation of the EU Law Enforcement Governance and Trade Action Plan, or also called the FLAG-T Action Plan, which was mentioned already. The idea behind this is to counter illegal logging and associated trade globally. There's also currently a work plan in place until 2022. And as one of the commitments under the communication, which was mentioned before, communication on stepping up EU action to protect and restore the world's forests, and this is important also for engagement of Indonesian stakeholders, a Commission expert group and multi-stakeholder platform has been established, which serves as a forum for the EU member states, but also other, including third country stakeholders, to advise the Commission on issues related to deforestation and forest degradation. The group also works on better implementing the EU FLAG-T Action Plan and the EU Timber Regulation. And this platform includes also the competent authorities of the member states, industry, farmers, landowners, so a wide range of stakeholders. And the first meetings of the working group on deforestation have just taken place a month ago. So this really is a fresh effort that can still be engaged in. Then, as the ambassador has mentioned already, Indonesia has concluded a voluntary partnership agreement, VPA, with the EU, as the EU does with a number of timber producing countries. And these VPA aim to promote trade in legal timber products and to prevent illegal timber products from being able to enter the European market. These VPAs are legally binding instruments, trade agreements, and a timber legality assurance system is put in place on this basis. And if a consignment of timber is verified as legal, it is then awarded a Flag T license. In this context, also the EU timber regulation obliges those who place timber on the EU market or timber products on the EU market to apply due diligence mechanisms to reduce the risk of importing illegally harvested timber. And enforcement is taken care of by the EU member states. As you know, Indonesia was the first country to issue licenses under this system, under its VPA. And Indonesia is by far the biggest Flag T VPA partner of the EU, with, in 2019, 1.1 billion euros of imports to the EU, under a total number of over 40,000 licenses. So this is very significant, with a lot of leverage towards the EU, of course. And then the final measures that are of key concern to many stakeholders, including Indonesian ones certainly, are the additional demand side measures that the European Commission is currently considering to put in place in relation to commodity imports to the EU, also to address the issue of deforestation caused by other drivers that are not being addressed by other policy or legal instruments. This assessment is currently ongoing. There will be an impact assessment, and as a step before this, at the moment, there's a public consultation that stakeholders can participate in. Also, this public consultation, it has almost approached its deadline already, which is the 10th of December. But also in this case, of course, engagement can also take place at a later stage, but it's of course always good to engage early. This assessment of additional measures concerns regulatory and non-regulatory demand side measures, which with the idea that the EU imports deforestation with the products it imports, so it sees its own responsibility. In this list, and this is maybe something we can further discuss in the Q&A, you see a wide range of measures which are being considered with very different depth. So they would have very different influence on stakeholders. I would suggest that we can discuss this at a later stage. As regards to the challenges and opportunities, we have identified the below elements, 1 to 3, the post-2020 EU forest strategy, as well as the potential additional demand side measures, which can be quite impactful on stakeholders, as well as the reinforced implementation of the FLEGT action plan and the EU timber regulation. In the interest of time, I would suggest that we could also address this in the Q&A, because this can bring along all kinds of business obstacles, increased costs, of course, depending on the measures that will be introduced, both for companies and for the government. But as I said, there's always room to engage. As Jeroen said, this is welcomed by the Commission and it's needed. And with these words, I would like to briefly hand over still to Jeroen to conclude our presentation and to briefly discuss how concretely Indonesian government and especially company stakeholders can participate in the policy and regulatory process in order to have their interests reflected. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I will have to switch on off. Sorry. The engagement, as I referred to in my introduction, point of departure is that the European Union, when it develops policies and legislation and regulation, is obliged and does happily comply with this obligation to consult with stakeholders. It is, of course, an illusion to think that on all the topics of policy and regulation, there will be an overall consensus. But the consultative process allows stakeholders, and in particular also third countries and industries in those third countries, and third countries meaning countries outside the European Union, to have a say and to register their interests and their concerns in that EU policy and legislative process. This is a very core element in policy making and legislation that is actually quite unique. In many cases, it will be in other third countries, for example, very difficult for European companies or individual member states to have a significant statutory influence on how these policies are developed and agreed. And this is therefore a unique opportunity to optimize the impact that industries that will be affected ultimately by European standard setting, normalization, legislation. It is a unique opportunity to engage and make sure that the arguments, the considerations, the data and realities from production in the field and so on and so forth are registered with and discussed in dialogue with the European Commission. So point of departure is there is an open door, and that is quite structured. This is based on provisions in the European treaties, and a central theme or a central element better of this EU interest representation is always the public consultation that the European Commission needs to conduct before it engages in policy and legislation. That is a public consultation, so every stakeholder affected, be it a European-based stakeholder or an internationally third country-based stakeholder, can actually actively participate in these consultations. These consultations subsequently are the results of the consultation. So what all the other stakeholders have said about a particular topic, in this case, EU forestry or the EU trade policy review, can later be reviewed and analyzed because all the submissions will be made public. So within the initial stages of consultation and preparation of policy, there is a full overview of what your colleagues and competitors also in other countries or in the EU or trading partners in the EU demonstrate as relevant in these consultations. These consultations are online and follow the format of fixed questions. So it is basically responding to these questions that does the trick. It is not a very complex process. If you know your business and the industry you're active in, then it is possible to do this. In many cases, it is important to do this not as an individual company. You might do this as an individual company, but also do this as part of industry federations and associations. The appeal for the European policymaker and legislator to listen to industry associations and federations is that they don't have to listen to 20,000 individual companies, but they have a agreed common position of the industry formulated by that association and federation. Of course, that is a result of a process within the membership of these associations and federations. Some call it the lowest common denominator or the highest achievable position, but nevertheless, it is, of course, the voice of many, coordinated and presented by the unity of an association and federation. And of course, then subsequently, there is the traditional diplomatic support The diplomatic support that in the case of EU forestry policy, as we are discussing it today, will be delivered and in the interest, of course, of the Indonesian stakeholders in this particular industry through the Indonesian embassy in Brussels and potentially by other European or Indonesian embassies in other European countries. Because don't forget, it is not only the European Commission, it is also the Council and the Member States and the European Parliament that play a role in these processes, and they are all accessible. And sometimes you have to apply these classic traditional diplomatic channels to bring your point across. And Indonesia is known for an excellent service in that respect. How to approach this? As I said, a lot of the information is available if you follow the topics via the quite well-established public sources websites of the European Commission. The embassies generally also generate policy updates and briefings. And once you have a full understanding of what will come your way in terms of policy and legislation, you should start thinking about how a campaign-based approach for bringing your interests across, how that would look like. Now, there are several components, classic traditional components in managing such a campaign-based approach that should be kept in mind and are self-evident almost. You should, of course, monitor, analyze, and report on what the current developments are. You have to then, on the basis of what you understand will be happening, for example, in the field of the forest policy, and it's not only about tariffs and about import duties. It is much broader than that. You should try to assess what does that mean for the industry, the affected industry, the stakeholder industry in a particular country, in this case in Indonesia. And on the basis of the understanding what it could mean, it is important to register and start developing the positions, the position papers, the arguments, and the best, let's say, the best options in terms of outcome that you would like to achieve, and the reasons why this is so relevant and makes sense, in order subsequently to share that with the European institutions. In addition, you will not only have the Indonesian importers, or sorry, the Indonesian exporters and companies and industry associations in Indonesia itself. They have also commercial and industrial counterparts in the European Union, one of the biggest internal markets in the world. So also those stakeholders, those contacts are relevant for developing a European outreach, because if on EU forestry the positions are aligned between the stakeholders in Indonesia and their colleagues and friends in the European Union, that will register, of course, very well. That requires, of course, coordination, and it requires a structure and a system, but it is highly advisable. Then, of course, another fixed feature is if you have a position, if you have come to the conclusion that you would like to engage, then with whom at the European side should you engage? And that, of course, is not only Commission, Council, Parliament, it is much more subtle than that. There are DGs, the Directorates General, there are units, there are departments and directorates. It is a bit of a labyrinth, and you have to be carefully assessing who is actually in charge and who will make the decisions. Same in the European Parliament, which committee in the Parliament, which member states have, for example, special relationships with Indonesia. And these member states have members in the European Parliament that might also be positively disposed towards the country or towards the topic that is the subject of the engagement campaign. And then, of course, the engagement itself. You have to prepare your position papers. Of course, during the COVID time, many of the contacts will be over email, and via Zoom teleconferencing or video conferencing. But there will be a moment in time, and hopefully sooner rather than later, that physical meetings will again be possible. And then you have to do these meetings and these meeting programs. That is something that the industry can do by itself, perhaps with a bit of outside support. But also the embassies play an important role here, because they are already in a frontline position to observe and assist. And I think our advice always is to coordinate closely, but also take a more active role as an industry yourself. There are well-organized industry associations and federations in Indonesia on many sectors and industries. I believe that the room for improvement is a better visibility and engagement of these sectors and industries in Europe. Also teaming up, as I mentioned before, with European partners in that particular sector or industry, and create or think about a rather more strategic campaign-based approach than just an ad hoc activity or an ad hoc communication that you would send. Because these legislative processes, whether it is for a new directive or regulation, give you one more example, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is something that is currently creating fear among many third countries. It is about a compensation system for carbon leakage, where the European Union is reducing its carbon emissions. They fear that in unfair competition, these carbon emitting industries will relocate outside the EU in order to compete with stringent norms respecting companies in the EU. I'm not going into the technical detail, but this is a process of legislation that will ultimately result in a European directive that will probably take between anywhere, it is just kicked off by consultation. It will take up to 12-18 months before the result will be known, and that period can effectively be used to engage, and it is therefore not an ad hoc issue. It should be campaign based and should be developed with the horizon that is appropriate to consider in these cases. Now, in conclusion, EU forestry policy, there are not yet too many very concrete, how shall we say, restrictive or opportunistic measures. That is all in development. As I mentioned before, if you are not at the table, you will be on the menu. A kind message to say that industry engagement, national engagement is very relevant. There is a wealth of information to share with the European institutions, and they will appreciate that. It is an open and consultative process, and it is not the EU versus the rest of the world. It is creating also opportunities, in particular for Indonesia, to design and to develop additional best-in-class economic links, in particular industry sectors, aligned with, in itself, laudable goals like the Green Deal, decarbonization. Indonesia has both the territory, the knowledge, and the ambition, and the possibility, in my view, to largely align with that and support the EU in those efforts. And the EU will be very open to continue that according to the trade relations and discussions to support that. I will leave it at that. Jelmen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeroen. And as you mentioned, indeed, Indonesia and Europe are important trading partners, and you also already touched COVID, which is increasing stress on the system and increasing awareness here about issues such as health and environment. A lot is happening indeed, but I'm very pleased that you noticed that the Commission and Parliament are open to receive input. It can be a collaborative effort, as you said. And as Laura mentioned, I also remember mostly that the EU Action Plan to protect and restore the world's forest has an explicit priority to partner up with producing countries. Public consultation, role of industry associations, embassy you mentioned, and of course the need to demonstrate that EU partners can be part of the ruling class. It's not necessarily restrictive. Unless you are on the table, you are on the menu. So please, you came with a warning, please be there. For the Q&A, we've already received a question from Mathieu Brucker, DCI consultant from the UK, which mentioned that in the latest development from the UK government regarding the due diligence for palm oil, timber and other forest commodities, there's also a consideration of local origin certification. We've briefly touched indeed that member states are also still playing a strong role in Europe. Could you perhaps clarify a bit on that? Or have we got video from Mathieu? No?
Do you want me to clarify something?
Yes, I think we should have a video from Mathieu actually. So
okay, well let's look at.
Do we have video? Mathieu? I got a short comment that the video and the microphone don't work. But yeah, Jeroen, undoubtedly you are aware of the current due diligence processes and how also member states are already taking initiatives in that regard to the UK around human rights. And apparently now today also increasingly looking at local origin certification. Would you be able or willing to share your thoughts of member states?
Yes, it's a very good observation, and I think a very pertinent point, because this is one of the new elements that we will see more in the future. Due diligence in the supply chain is not limited to our environmental concerns. There is a high pressure, and this is also for Asia and Southeast Asia of relevance. For example, on labor standards, human rights in particular sensitive industries, or industries that are usually highly affected by this, in particular textiles and clothing. So what we see as a trend is that where perhaps a few years ago, these kind of due diligence standards of environmental sustainability, human rights, labor conditions in free trade agreements would be rather symbolic. And actually Brexit has driven this notion of how to address this and bring this to the next level. And is there consensus to bring this to the next level? Because it adds another layer of compliance issues, of course, as well, and therefore could increase also the cost in a company to do this. But Brexit brought forward this notion because some cynics or let's say engaged observers would say, yeah, the UK is now going to compete with the EU since they have left. And they might require less stringent standards in their trade agreements, not completely similar or aligned anymore with the increased sustainability, human rights, social equality, and so on standards that the European Union is. So that was the background, or a large part of the background on this due diligence throughout the supply chain. What is interesting to note, and this is something I think we have to understand, and it will not go away, that over the years, what the trendsetters in these environmental norms, sustainable development have said is, as trendsetters, being a relatively small and ambitious, almost activist group of policymakers and legislators. The acceptance of these and the underscoring of the importance of these standards has significantly increased throughout European society. So the political the political acceptance, the societal acceptance, if you wish, public opinion, tend very much towards sustainability, responsible supply chains, and everything that comes along with that. And that is why sustainability, environment, it is not only an issue for forestry, it is a horizontal issue, I would call, in the European Union policy toolbox. And yes, member states, it will differ from member state to member state, but they will take a very active view also. But don't forget, in terms of trade is not a member state prerogative. It is a prerogative for the European Union itself. So it is member states contribute to the process and are co-decision makers. But I think the question that was initially raised, the member state, the specific member state involvement, you have to bear with me. That is something I cannot cannot answer at this stage.
It's indeed complicated, and as you mentioned, it's no longer just forests, and it's no longer just trendsetters. It's a very important observation that you made there. It's broadly recognized and important, and indeed EU surveys show numbers of over 90% of people that attach very high importance to issues such as pollution and so on. We've got another question from Ms. Ida Krishnamurthy, the Special Staff on Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Indonesia, which says, yeah, prioritizing downstream is one element. We've talked about Indonesia and the focus here on the world's forests. Is the EU also doing something locally here, or is it just looking outside? What are they doing about the forests here in Europe?
Laura, you want to say a few words on that?
Yes, very happy to do so. This I believe is an impression that I may have caused in my presentation, but of course the EU forest strategy, the post-2021 will also be very focused on domestic issues, on supply chains within the EU, on addressing deforestation and forest degradation in EU member states, because this is also a key issue on EU territory. I would say that this is actually the focus of the EU forest strategy, but there is certainly also a key global angle to this. But essentially the same actions that are being taken at the global level are absolutely also taken within the EU.
Yeah. To add to that, of course, over the last few years, and I think that Germany is the country with the largest forest area per comparatively. What we have seen there due to climate change, that some of the traditional forestation is disappearing, and throughout societies in Europe, there's a high level of concern. It is not only the pictures from Brazil, which is of course the poster child of how not to have a proper forestry policy, but that definitely also motivates to look in our own into our own backyards. And I think forestry policy is a national policy as well. And you see that there are quite stringent measures in Europe in protected areas, forestry areas, and other natural reserves, where, for example, you cannot even establish a mobile phone transmission system, because that is one of the 15 or 20 elements of things not to do in a forest area. So it is impactful, very highly regulated, and also the wood production and the replanting is something that is taken very seriously at the national level. But we have to admit there's more forest outside the European Union that plays a key role in also the climate development, as well as the ecosystem health, I would say. And that awareness, of course, when the European Union can contribute to a more global approach, and also then support partners with technical assistance, and in some cases also with funding, I think that is something worthwhile to continue to explore. But yes, no, we're not off the hook in Europe. We have to seriously take care of our forests as well.
Yes, indeed. A lot of things happening here as well. And you already mentioned there is a big umbrella. It's the Green Deal that looks both internally and externally. And also from Ina, there's the follow-up question saying, yeah, how can you feel convinced when you already mentioned it's a challenge for us as well. But the topic of this webinar is challenges and opportunities. How can you convince that this foreign trade-based policy is not restrictive, discriminate land-based product versus land-based products? How can it also become an opportunity? How can we look at that in those terms?
Well, if I may, Jelmen, I believe that if you understand the object and purpose of what the EU would like to achieve with a further and enhanced forestry policy, where the underlying ideas of sustainability, preserving biodiversity, combating deforestation. If you look at that, then if you apply that to Indonesia and also to the industry, the forestry industry, no doubt that it creates opportunities to see if you, in your particular domain, and the forestry industry is very diverse also in the type of companies. It's not only chopping timber and then exporting it. No, it goes much further than that. There might be opportunities to cooperate with European partners and create a sort of what I always very much like is a best-in-class status for a particular activity or for a particular range of products. Looking at organic production, forestry is one thing, but if you look at everything organic and bio labeled and certified, there is also an increasing market for that type of products. So it is difficult for me because I wish to be more involved in the forestry industry itself in Indonesia, but no doubt there is also with the European partners of the trading partners in Indonesia, there must be opportunities for a best-in-class and accelerated commercial and trading activity for those products available.
Yeah, a clear call again to cooperate also with EU partners and create a best-in-class status. And this leads nicely to the question by Agus Purnomo from Golden Agri Resource. We already see a lot of voluntary actions, both from Indonesian industry, also European industry, our members as well, taking a lot of voluntary actions. And actually our sector is doing comparatively well. I think it's a front runner in that extent worldwide. Will the EU forest policy allow for voluntary certification, or will the implementation be solely focused on government entities, such as the due diligence requirements? How do you see that evolving, Jeroen?
Now, I think we both our team and others have been thinking about this voluntary certification and so on and so forth. I think it is an excellent example of a methodology whereby you as an industry have also control over what you are voluntarily, because you drive it, it's voluntary in its core, and then set the standard. And that is why it is so important to communicate and engage with the European policymakers overall on this issue of voluntary action and have that recognized. Now, there are multiple ways of recognizing such a voluntary. You can have preferential treatment, or you will be able to develop this voluntary action into a regulated standard. But you can only achieve this with the appropriate engagement with the institutions. Of course, everything in terms of voluntary and preferential should also be viewed in accordance with the overall trading rules and WTO standards. But no, voluntary and best in class, front runners, you mentioned it, Jelme, The European, I strongly believe that Indonesia can continue to produce frontrunners in this respect. And that with the European partners, and I don't mean necessarily the institutions, yes, ultimately the institutions, the European institutions, no, but with their trading and commercial partners, in combination with embassy or commercial and agricultural section embassy support. Very important to figure that out. And if you think you have a voluntary scheme or a voluntary action that could fit, then discuss it, test it, and in particular make sure that also your counterparts in Europe highlight this in their marketing and branding materials, not only from the Indonesian side.
A very important note you add there, that indeed it's about also branding here in Europe and getting the confidence from the markets here in Europe for your actions. But again, you highlight that there are opportunities here. There's opportunities for reputation gains, for positioning yourself as the best in class. Another question that is very closely related to that, and that we also see here in Europe, is even if you create these front-runner status, even if you get this best in class status, there is still it's a very broad field. You mentioned forestry, human rights, what are others doing, and so on. So a question from Panka Pramudia is how do we see in Indonesia that improving sustainability in the forest sector is influencing confidence in Indonesia's efforts for also improving sustainability in other commodities? Do we see spillover effects that are positive examples, or how would you see that evolving ideally?
It is also a question I think that that could be addressed to the embassy. They might also have examples. And more generally, I would say that if you in the forestry industry have achieved a certain best-in-class status or are frontrunner or have done your extra efforts, this is not only for indeed the forestry industry. This is for any manufacturing industry, for any global supply line. Textiles is also a big headache. The crossover or the cross-fertilization of sharing experience and actually trying, and this is difficult because there's another element here. When textiles is concerned, you can have the best of intentions. It will, however, in many cases increase the price of production, and that would then assumably affect your competitive position. And why is this an issue? Because European consumers, we also have to look at ourselves. European consumers are used to rock bottom prices for example, a t-shirt, a simple t-shirt. So there is a lot of criticism, and my hope in this respect to help sustainable and responsible production in third countries, including in Indonesia, is what is among other countries proposed in Germany, to have a minimum price for certain products. A minimum price, consumer price, that is actually based on the real production cost, so that the stress is taken out of the system when it comes to cost versus social and other standards. That could be an example. But sharing experience, I think it starts with sharing experience. I have had conversations with people in the textiles industry that said, look, what we have done, we get zero credit for it. Our exports are down, and nobody seems to care. So it is, it is not easy, but sharing experience among sectors, sharing experience between, for example, the industry associations and federations per sector, is an option that we have seen and that has been very helpful in some cases. And again, continued conversations with your European partners, because it's a joint effort, clearly. And it's not only a transactional commercial element here, although the bottom line counts, of course.
bottom line counts, not only transactional, commercial, and Rinus Kinseng also adds here in his question that again focusing on the interrelation between also palm oil developments, growth, reduction of poverty. From a European perspective, we notice that an SDG framework that we look at continuously, it's one system. It's not just focusing on one item, it's balancing. And when we're talking about deforestation and the ambition to develop, it can also contribute significantly for poverty reduction. Do you see that this is a hindrance to poverty reduction? Are there opportunities? How can we bring up this issue in the debate here?
You mean the social development goals?
Social development goals, indeed, yes.
Well, what you will see, and what we have analyzed before, is that it starts with a plan and with an ambition and with a policy, but it is very abstract. It is down the timeline of implementation and execution that you will encounter the difficulties and the points for which fine-tunings or repairs have to be provided. The COVID crisis in that sense really does not help, because even those projects that were well underway and activities and development cooperation efforts have now been hampered by two things: by people being locked down or not able to move. Although in some countries that is less of an issue, but mainly many of these efforts remain underfunded. Because budgets are spent elsewhere. So there is a bit of a delay, but in terms of sustainability, social development goals, I think that every human rights, sustainability in particular, that is a topic that will continue to influence not only all sectors, but it will continue to influence the overall EU trading policies and sub-components of that trade policy. And it is therefore better to take stock of where the EU trade philosophy and policy and regulation will go, in order to adjust sounds a bit what we don't want. To take stock, then engage collectively with the European institutions and further develop this, so that it does not, when it comes to the point of becoming a policy or a fixed regulation or law, that does not come as a surprise, where the people say, Europe rules the world. No, we rule the world together, and it provides these opportunities, but be there at an early stage of the policy and legislative process. Share your frustrations and experience and ambitions and good plans, and entrepreneurs will do this. I mean, they will start thinking. I'm always surprised in a time of a crisis like the COVID crisis that you see particular industries or innovations and new ideas popping up. So yeah, let's hope that these processes and also these in itself abstract terms like social development goals or the compliance thereof, it's a mix. It's a mix that is in many ways too abstract. But if it applies to your sector or to the company operating in your sector, there's probably more that you can do about it to make it concrete, including a positive action or voluntary action and self-certification, whatever it is, then you might think. So I'm generally optimistic in that sense. Probably did not answer the question, by the way, but.
It was a very important observation, actually, when you say that it's very abstract. We need to make it concrete, and that's definitely something that also from my European perspective, we see it's a very abstract debate that needs to respond to very strong emotions very often for the consumer.
Well, I'm just on that point, and then that is also why in these type of webinars and presentations, it is also so important that we point out that it sounds often too abstract, and the audience should also have the benefit of more concrete or concretization of several of these. What does it mean for me in my company, in my industry? And I think that that is the next step. You know, after sketching the overall framework, I think feedback or case studies from these companies in Indonesia in this sector could be produced along the lines of what is my experience so far, what is my fear, what is my hope, what actually do I do, and how do I do it, and how does that conform to, and are there opportunities to better align with the European policy and regulation. And this alignment, I wish to underline the alignment, is not to submit to EU rule. No, it is not this you know zero-sum game. It is a process, and a consultative process based on wherever we can, we will try to reach a consensus between the third country interests and European interests. And I think that ultimately what we want is that sustainable development, environment, biodiversity, forestation, combating deforestation, that adds to a better world for ourselves and our children. And that is in itself a fluffy statement. But that is actually what it boils down to. So there is no indoctrination or imposition of rules. There's just science and insights that result in policy. But the point here is, and the beauty of the European Union as one of the few legislative policy-making centers in the world, it is very much open to hear the voice of others also from outside the European Union. And one should seize that opportunity. I'm convinced. I'm a believer.
Underlining the alignment, you mentioned that it's not just about submitting to EU rule, but it's about reaching consensus indeed. And what you call a fluffy statement, the better world for ourselves and our children. I've had the luxury to be in Indonesia and talking with industry there, talking with people there, it's something that they also very much understand. I think there already is a basis of building bridges and working together. When you're saying science and insights that lead to concrete policy actions, we've got a question there also from Iqbal Amrullah that says, how can you make this advice to communicate and to be involved in the process concrete? When will the EU proposal on the schemes, on the due diligence schemes and so on be launched? Are there already consultations ongoing today? How can we concretely get involved?
Well, thank you. And again, that's to the point. I think this is this webinar on this topic for this industry sector is a point of departure. The train has slowly started to leave the station, but we can still jump on the last wagon, or on the former last wagon. Otherwise, we would endanger ourselves. But the whole point is that with a coherent strategy for outreach and practical engagement, it would be possible to first of all be aware of where the discussions are, also on due diligence, for example, which discussions are ongoing. So there will be developments to report. One of the ideas that we had, and I just throw it up as a suggestion for practical approach here. Because if you are in Indonesia, to follow what is happening in Europe, let alone to be engaged, is a bit of a stretch. What we have thought about was, for example, to create a platform for Indonesia business and commerce, specifically focused on EU policy and regulation. Call it an EU-Indonesia business, European Business Council or business platform. That platform would do three things. First of all, it would monitor and report all relevant developments, in particular commercial areas or industry sectors, the consequences of the policies, as well as the regulatory and legislative activities affecting companies in Indonesia. And thirdly, make sure that everybody is able in time to participate in these public consultations, and or create a platform where also these policy papers or position papers and policy papers are produced and submitted, and where people can actually, if travel to Brussels is possible, organize also meeting programs with Commission, Council, Member States, as well as the European Parliament. So that needs a bit of organization, of course, and a structure, but it would prevent that Indonesian companies would miss out on important information, of which they actually will become very enthusiastic that also to see that their positions are registered with the Europeans and are referred to. It's also subsequently an issue of country branding and positioning yourself and the strength of your diplomacy. And the second element combined with that is that such an effort, when it would be focused on Brussels and the EU institutions, would of course always be in close cooperation and conjunction with the Indonesian diplomacy. Both the classic bilateral diplomacy, the political diplomacy, as well as the economic and commercial diplomacy. I think that is conditio sine qua non, which is Latin for be so, in order to be effective. And we have seen examples where in a very cost-effective and structured manner, this could be achieved. Again, a very long answer to say that there are huge opportunities for interest representation.
Yes, indeed, huge opportunities, and we see a lot of developments already, both on supply chain, also landscapes, and the local jurisdiction approaches. How do you see that? And that was also a question here that we got from.
Local landscape. I need a bit of guidance on the question, Jan.
On the one hand, we see supply chain approaches. Industry here, for example, that is developing certification schemes, platforms also on talking about sustainability. What would sustainability mean for us? On the other hand, we also see increasingly that in local jurisdictions, with local government, they are trying to raise the floor for everybody.
Yeah.
Having that broader impact in landscapes where there is, on the one hand, predominantly palm oil, on the other hand, landscapes where there are also other commodities. Have you got insights on how the local development and the supply chain, so it's supply versus sector versus landscape?
Well, I mean, I would limit my answer to the observation that local standards and rules or local measures, and I refer to local measures throughout the European Union, are of course very visible because it belongs to the identity and also the branding of certain communities, regions, and cities. It's all fine, and we see a lot of it, and it's all done within the margins of the legislative limitations that exist. So you will be bound, of course, by certain rules not to exclude particular accepted technologies or products in that sense, but you can steer towards local fine-tunings in that sense. For the rest, I would. Our focus is mainly on the European policy, where you see in the conversations, as at least before COVID, you see that many, for example, in terms of smart cities and vertical farming, these kind of very exciting topics. Yeah, these local communities that have pilot projects in that sphere, they really advertise those projects if they are successful. And also if they're not successful, you know, the lessons learned and all that at the European level. I mean, there was a lot of attention to smart cities, cradle to cradle, circular economy. These things often find the best initiatives at local or regional level, and that is something. It's very valuable. But whether it is really impactful, I'm just not in a position to say.
But you do highlight again that seeking for front runners, highlighting good practices for reputation and also managing that element. On the other hand, we still sometimes see calls for muscle flexing. And there was a question also from Hari Priyadi. that says, yeah, how would you see a possible scenario where Indonesia chooses, instead of dialogue, to go towards muscle flexing and a reciprocal policy with trade restrictions and so on? What are your opinions on that?
First of all, I would hope that that is not going to happen, because these type of muscle flexing usually does not really result to something concrete or better. Having said that, if we talk about muscle flexing, then it would also mean that Indonesia or any other third country that would like flex muscles would negate on international agreements. And I think that is, for many third countries, is not a very attractive option, because you would lose out on the trade volume that in the relation between Indonesia and the European Union is very significant. The European Union is the third trading partner globally of Indonesia. And that impact in itself would require a continued engagement, and indeed best in class and front runners, innovative companies and individuals that flex their muscles with their innovations and with their excellence, rather than in restrictive measures. There's another problem with that, and I said, I mean, I'd like to hear also arguments then why Indonesia or any third country would flex its muscles against the EU, because Indonesia is on its way to conclude a free trade agreement with the European Union. It has already a partnership agreement that also has specific terms for deepening the cooperation. And I know for a fact from, let's leave trade outside the scope for a moment. There's another important element in international peace and security. Indonesia is also a crucial partner for the European Union. And overall, there is a belief now and a growing awareness that also thanks to the active role of countries like Indonesia, Singapore, several others, and upcoming economies in the ASEAN region, ASEAN itself as a group, will be much more prominent in the coming years, and this prominence is accompanied by trade opportunities and by like-mindedness, how we deal with particular challenges around the globe. The pandemic and the shortfall of supply chains and the dependence, for example, on China and India. Should, in my view, be construed as a strategic tactical opportunity for Indonesia to further align to further develop its relationships in several sectors. We at some point will also speak about farm to fork, sustainable food production and food security, security of production, not only the safety of food safety, but the production of sufficient foodstuffs globally. This creates an opportunity on some domains to shorten the global supply chain and have a more controlled supply chain, for example, between Indonesia and the European Union in some respects. So in that sense, ASEAN overall, and Indonesia as the most significant economy in that group, can benefit, irrespective of this recently concluded free trade arrangement where also China is part, and Australia, I believe, or New Zealand. I looked at that in detail, but I think it is less deep and sophisticated as the trade agreement that is now currently being considered with the European Union. Will also bring more value, in my view.
Thank you. And last question, and before we go to, and then I'll invite you for some concluding remarks. You mentioned already sustainable food systems, food security, and it's all very complicated. And a question from Ahmad Edin Nugro, it says, is it possible to make it simpler? We talked about muscle flexing, and often pushback is just a request and for more information. It's highly complicated. Can it be more simple, or is it necessarily so that it's complicated because of the many dimensions and the global system?
look, then we have to turn it the other way around. And I think between abstract presentation of concepts and all that, and what does it actually mean for the timber company operating from Sumatra somewhere, yeah, that is where I think, as a methodology, the case studies come in. If you know what a company is doing, what is the core business of their operation, what effectively do they produce, how do they produce it, and to whom do they export, and whom do they use to export it to? How is that organized for that specific company? Then you can basically check that against the policy and regulatory frameworks and say, look, this is completely irrelevant. Forget about that. It is burning somewhere in the background. But for you, in this case, or for this category of companies, the following policy and opportunities for excellence exist. And this is what you can do, and this is how you can engage. And for example, if there is a particular sector or a group of companies that is not represented by an industry association or federation, I would strongly advise to consider establishing these associations. What I also think is cooperatives, but that's something more for the commercial side. In order to cope with unfair competition, cooperatives can play an important role, but also as a center for knowledge and regulatory, how shall we say, regulatory data. But to make it simple, yeah, you have to relate what it means to your specific company or your specific industry on the ground. But in order to make it tangible and real, I think you, as a methodology, could also reverse it. What is this company doing? Send a case study. We can have a look at it, and then say, well, this is what really is in it for you, and this is where you can scale up. Not so much as in the function of a consultant, but more as a as a guide to use to an optimum the largely publicly available information and channels to influence. But it is not easy. It is it is complex.
Yeah, it is not easy. It's not complex, and I think this can also lead us to an important concluding remark that if something is not easy and complex, we need to be prepared to be there for the long run. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And we want to be partners in the end and move towards a partnership. And that is also, I think, an important message for all, also in Europe. We can only expect results maybe a few years from now. We cannot expect to be there tomorrow. We are important trading partners today and historically, and we want to be there ideally also in the future. And in the current environment, we see an increasing awareness on some challenges, highlighting in that also the opportunities for cooperation and for developing the supply chain together, to developing the value or the value chain together is a huge opportunity. The dialogues are now ongoing. As you mentioned, Commission and Parliament are indeed open to receive input. It is a collaborative element where they explicitly mention the ambition to partner up with producing countries. And it's now a clear invitation also to producing countries and also EU to show that as partners we can be part of the ruling class. As you mentioned, Jeroen, it's not necessarily restrictive, but unless you are on the table, you are on the menu. So I thank you very much for a very, very insightful analysis of what is happening in Europe and some very clear messages on the way forward. By this, I conclude for everybody. Thank you very much, and another good afternoon and almost a good evening for Indonesia. Thank you.
Okay.
Jeroen
and also Laura and also Yelben for the great conversation discussion this morning. I hope we all get a very good benefit for us, all of us, especially how we can come up and how we can face the challenges in the future, especially related to the EU policy. It's not only the forest policy, but also the other policy. And like we hear in Brussels, the embassies are going to have another series of webinar, I think starting next year, especially for each of commodities. So I think we could get a very specific highlight for each commodities and how we can come up with a solution and how we can face and build the engagement and build a better network between industry in Indonesia and also the stakeholder in the Europe also in the regulatory sector. I think thank you very much for everybody who still joined us for the last 1.5 hours. It's amazing because it's still around 150 persons still engaged with this Zoom meeting in the platform. So I think thank you very much for everybody who's still connecting with us. So we see you again in the next webinar, series webinar from Embassy of Indonesia in Brussels. Thank you. Maybe we should take a picture together first before leaving.
Of course.
Okay. Yes, we can. Please open your video. Okay. Okay, this is, we have 6 pages. So we can start with the first pages. Okay, 1, 2, 3. And next pages. Okay. Okay. Yes. You can unmute all the speakers so we can greet up each other. So thank you very much for the attendance.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Terima kasih.
Thank you. Terima kasih.
Thank you Pak Dubes, Bapak Ibu sekalian.
Terima kasih Bu Mary.
Thank you.
Terima kasih Bu Mary.
Pak Dubes
Terima kasih
Ferry,
banyak, Pak
terima kasih
Dubes.
Pak Rusman, terima kasih Pak Rusman.
Terima kasih
Pak
Dupito. Thank you
Halo Pak Andri, terima kasih ya.
Halo.
Sukses selalu ya Pak.
Pak
Pak Dubes
Dubes.
Andri.
Terima kasih Pak.
Sukses selalu. Kapan
Terima
main ke
kasih,
Athena?
Pasti, insya Allah Pak. Dan saya tunggu juga teman-teman di Indonesia kalau sudah pandemi berakhir, most welcome. Datang ke Brussels. Thank you Pak. Pak Jerome terima kasih. Pak Has terima kasih Pak. Terima kasih.
Thank you everybody.
Terima kasih Pak Rusman.
Terima kasih semua, Mary, Wahida, Pak Andri, Pak Dubes.
Terima kasih Pak Rusman. Terima kasih.
Chairman.
Terima kasih. Pas maghrib kalau di Makassar ini. Ya.
Terima kasih Pak Rufi. Mohon Pak De.
Ya, baik. Bagi Mbak.
Ada Pak Rufi.
Woi.